All right, everybody, we are live. Dynasty Mirror Search for Huru. And I have Professor Davis with us today, who specializes in post higher secondary education. Me and Professor Davis, we've been chopping it up the last couple of days, and he's been dropping so many jewels on me and just so much knowledge on me in regards to a lot of information that we don't know and history that we don't know in regards to Black America's contribution to Africa and to the world. That a lot of it is just a lot of people don't know. So I had to beg this brother to come on and just share the information because people need to hear this. So I'm so happy for having Professor Davis on with us today. Professor Davis, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you. We are thankful. It's a blessing.
Well, it's my pleasure.
Yeah, so I mean, we could just jump right into it. I know when we were speaking. I don't know if you want to share the name of the organization you're part of.
Affiliated
with.
I think you're talking now about the Africa America Institute.
Correct.
This is right. This particular organization was founded by two African American professors. The first is Dr. Horace Bond, who's the father of Julian Bond, and Dr. Horace Bond was also the president of Lincoln University, which is one of the most prestigious HBCUs in the country. And the second professor is Dr. William Leo Hasbury, and Dr. Hasbury was the founder of African Studies at Howard University in 1922. Both professors came together, and they felt the need to have an institution that would assist African nations in leadership. And this organization was started in 1953. So it predates the independence of most sub-Saharan African countries. But the goal was to have this institution to be able to assist Africans in terms of leadership development, economic development, and so on and so forth. But I can assure you that today, the Africa America Institute, or AAI for short, is probably the most renowned philanthropic organizations in the world. And tens of thousands of Africans have benefited from this institution. For example, if you look at the alumni list today, you have presidents, prime ministers, Nobel laureates, multi-million-dollar startup corporations. And unfortunately, it's not well known because this is something else.
That's why you're here. That's why you're here. Go ahead.
Right, and this is, and you and I spoke about this before, and this particular institution was established by, this is something that we don't speak about in the African American community, but it was established by the African American elite. And we briefly talked about that as well. I shared with you that the Black elite in America has been around since the 1800s.
Correct.
And so this particular a segment of Black America felt the need to have an institution in place that could assist African countries as they move from colonialism to freedom. And I think I shared with you some of the things that the Africa America Institute is doing. I mean, across the continent, and it's massive.
Right.
But again,
but before we're done, make sure you share the people what they're doing as well.
Sure, absolutely. I give you, like, for example, right now, one small example, the country of Mauritius, which is a small island nation out in the Indian Ocean near Madagascar. The current CEO of the stock exchange for Mauritius is an alumni of AAI, or the Africa America Institute. And because he got the scholarship to go to school and to further his education, today Mauritius is one of the wealthiest countries in Africa. He was able to take his country from being, if you will, a developing country to now a firmly middle income nation in Africa. He's just one example. Another example would be some of the leaders in South Africa who've also had a chance to to also get funding to go to school, either on the African continent or in the United States. For example, you've been to West Africa, and I'm sure you've been to the Ivory Coast. Is that correct?
I have not. I'm going to the
Well,
Ivory Coast in September.
well, the current president of the Ivory Coast also received a grant from the Africa America Institute, and he got his PhD from Penn State University. And today, man, the Ivory Coast is one of the fastest growing economies in West Africa. I think it's growing at like 6 or 7% a year. And so, again, it's also firmly a middle income nation. But AAI today, in 2018, has a footprint on the ground in all 54 African countries. We also briefly talked about Strive Masiyiwa, who is
Right.
the founder of Econet Wireless, and he's from Zimbabwe.
Right.
He was actually recruited by the former or past Dr. Lewis Sullivan, and also the Andrew Young, who was the mayor of Atlanta, and also the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. They were working for Clinton and President Clinton, and Clinton was looking for some young African leaders, and so they were in Zimbabwe. Mr. Sullivan saw him as a young man, asked him what he wanted to do, and Mr. Masiyiwa wanted to go to a school in Uganda called Makerere.
Okay.
And Mr. Sullivan said, well, if you can't make it there, come to Morehouse. So long story short, man, Andrew Young and Dr. Lewis Sullivan was able to recruit this young man to the United States. He spent roughly 10 years getting an education in America. Once he was complete, he goes back to Africa, and he became the founder of Econet Wireless, which is, as I said before, one of the largest mobile services on the African continent. And today, Mr. Masiyiwa is probably, if not the best, one of the best business leaders in Africa. This man now has philanthropic organizations across Africa and across Latin America, and this is a prime example of how, if you will, African Americans have actually had an impact not only not only in as I stated earlier in Mauritius, but also in Zimbabwe as well. Our contributions to the globe are massive. Most folks are aware of leaders like Martin Luther King, of course, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks. This is generally what we get during Black History Month. But beyond those fantastic leaders, there are just so many other people, not only in terms of civil rights leaders, but and also sports and entertainment, but science, technology, engineering. The list is just incredible. And I think that far too many African Americans and Americans, period, and even immigrants who are coming to the United States have a lack of understanding in terms of how African Americans have impacted not only the U.S. But also our neighbor to the north, Canada, and we'll probably can discuss that later as well.
Absolutely. Now I know the actual just some more. And I know I'm jumping ahead.
Sure.
Ethiopian Airlines. If we
Sure.
go into that as well.
Absolutely. I'll give you Colonel John Charles Robinson, who was really the father of the Tuskegee Airmen. Haile Selassie's cousin, Malcolm Byam, was at Howard University in the 1920s, and he was at Howard's medical school. And Malcolm Byam had reached out to Haile Selassie and says, "Listen, I know some African Americans who could possibly assist us." And this was during the Second Italian-Ethiopian War. And so Malcolm Byam says, "Hey, I know a Colonel Robinson. He's a pilot. He's with the Tuskegee Airmen, and maybe he can come to Ethiopia and assist us." And so Haile Selassie reached out to Colonel John Charles Robinson and said, "Listen, Ethiopia needs some help against the Italians." And so Colonel Robinson agreed to come to Ethiopia in the 1930s. While there, Haile Selassie made him the commander over the entire Ethiopian Air Force. And so he was rebuilding the Air Force. He also became Haile Selassie's personal pilot. And
Mm.
so, and so he was able to help along with the Allied forces, Ethiopia defeat the Italians. After the war was over, Colonel Robinson comes back to the United States. He builds an airline for, oh my God, for African Americans, for anyone. As a matter of fact, he built an airline here first, outside of Chicago, and some of the first graduates of that airline were Chinese pilots. But he goes back to Ethiopia with, a half dozen or so Tuskegee Airmen in 1944. They established Sultan Airlines, which emerges into East African Airlines. And in 1945, East African Airlines becomes Ethiopian Airlines. And so, what I'm saying to you, Dinas, is that the very, very foundation of Ethiopian Airline was actually built by Black Americans. And today, in 2018, Ethiopian Airline is the most advanced and the most successful and the most profitable airlines on the African continent. And as a matter of fact, it serves as a hub for training all other Africans.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Let me ask you this: why do you think this information isn't well known amongst I guess, the Black community and African community?
Well, and I think that there are a number of reasons, Dinus. I think class is one issue, and also the way that America is structured. We are first and foremost an international business, and that's what we are. And I think that most Americans, Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, it doesn't matter. We're more concerned with money than we are with academic pursuits. And so scholars like myself tend to take the time or have the time to dig up this information. The average American is unfortunately, unless you're interested in this area, is not going to take the time to do this. And that's why it's important for us, academics, to write and to get this information out, because this is massive. And let me just say this too. I tell people all the time that African American history is American history.
Correct.
And I do know people. How do I say this? Black Americans have had a very, very difficult, if you will, sojourn in the United States. And I'm going to use the words of Professor Gerald Horn at the University of Houston. And he said this. He says that African Americans have had a special type of persecution, which is true. And also, Dr. Henry Louis Gates has said that, and I quote, African Americans have had many rivers to cross. And I think that because of that marginalization, this may be also a factor too why so many people don't know. Now, I do want to say this. That's why it was extremely important that Mr. Bunch, oh God, the gentleman who was not Ralph Bunch, but the gentleman who was the founding, the president of the New Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture, his first, Lonnie Bunch. This is why it is so very important that that particular institution, man, was built. And it's strategically located right across the street, as you know, Dinus, from the Washington Monument.
Right.
Because again, the world needs to know our story. People need, and even new immigrants who are coming to America who unfortunately have not such a pleasant view of Black Americans.
Right.
They need to know this history.
Well,
because.
But what can we do? I know what we're doing plays an important part, but what can we do to remind them about the history? Because for the most part, with my experience, we remind them that pretty much MLK took a bullet for you guys. They pretty much don't care. It's like whatever. I mean, what can we do to really remind them that, hey, if it wasn't for us, you guys wouldn't be here in the first place?
Well, you know what, and I think that there are between 7,000 to 8,000 historical African American landmarks across the United States, in all 50 states. And so I think that that we're doing it. And again, as I stated earlier, with what the opening of the new Smithsonian Museum was monumental, because it was. Think about this, man. President Obama inaugurated the opening of this museum. This was actually televised, which was huge. And think about this too. In the first year, man, several million people visited that museum, and tickets are still hard to get. So people are anxious to know this history. And and so I think that we to answer your question specifically, I think we're doing it. I think we're getting the message out finally, and clearly there's much more to be done.
Okay, well, let's see if we got any questions in the chat room. Let's see here. Let's see. Let me ask you this: what does Prince Hall, or play a role in? I guess the institution, or a role in the Black Americans who helped build Africa, or at all, or
Well, Prince Hall was a Mason, of course. He
right?
was Bayesian. He was from Barbados, and as you know, the Masons are significant to the history of America. But let me just say this, man. What I think is more significant than Prince Hall is the legacy of the African Methodist Episcopal Church.
Okay, yeah, go into that. I know we spoke on that too. Go ahead and go into that.
Right, right, and so that was extremely an important institution. Because think about this, man. This organization founded back in 1787, right?
Uh-huh.
And one moment here, by Richard Allen, of course, who was born into slavery, and he was attending St. George's Church in Philadelphia, and unfortunately, the whites did not want blacks to sit with them, and so the entire congregation decided to leave, and they formed their own institution in 1787. Now,
Right.
think about this, man.
Go ahead.
And this is how, if you will, how if I'll put it to you this way: people's eyes were open way back in the day, especially Richard Allen. Think about this. He's naming a church the African Methodist Episcopal Church back in the 1700s, which is pretty mad, which is pretty amazing. And this institution grew, man, from its starting point in Philadelphia, and within less than 100 years, it's spread pretty much all over the United States. And today, man, this particular institution has a presence, I believe, in 6 continents. There are AME churches in every U.S. State, all over Canada. They're in the West Indies, South America, in about 25 countries in Africa. There are AME churches throughout Europe, in London, France, Holland. There are about 170 of them in India. And, and they build universities across the globe. As a matter of fact, man, we talked about John Dube, right, who was the founder of the African Methodist, who was the founder of the African National Congress in South Africa. And one of the ways that John Dube was able to come to the United States, or to travel here back and forth, is because of his interaction with the AME Church. Keep in mind, the AME Church has had a footprint in South Africa since the 1890s, and through and via the AME Church, John Dube, again the founder, or the founding president of the African National Congress, comes to the United States, meets with Booker T. Washington, right?
Uh-huh.
And he goes back, he establishes the Airlines Institute. And the Airlines Institute is a replica of the Booker T. Washington Tuskegee model. And it is the oldest institution founded by a Black South African. As a matter of fact, when Nelson Mandela was running or campaigning for the presidency in 1994, he symbolically cast his vote in the Airlines Institute. Mm-hmm. because of the symbolism. And let me give you another example of how the AME Church has been extremely important in not only in South Africa, but also in Namibia. Namibia was colonized by the Germans in the 1870s, I believe. And when the Germans came, they brought their church. They brought the Rhenish Missionary Church, or the German church. However, the Germans were marginalizing the Black Namibian leadership. And so, of course, the Namibian leadership, Black leadership, was aware of this particular situation. And so they met with the AME Church in South Africa, and they decided to do a mass conversion in 1946 from the German church to the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And from that time period, the AME Church played a leading role in helping to organize the leadership, the Black leadership in Namibia. And so when Namibia gets its independence in March of 1990, many of its elected officials are AME members.
Okay. What now? Hey, Afro Emporium. What's NAAMHC? Do you know what that is? He says he's a donor and charter member of it. Are you familiar with
again?
NAAMHC. Are you familiar with that organization?
NAAMC.
MHC.
Let me see what's it. Is that through in South Africa?
But I'm actually messaging him now. Until he
sure,
I guess, responds, can we get into the wealth of African Americans that many people don't know about post?
Right, sure. You know, and honestly, let me just say, Otis Graham, who is, I'm sure he wrote the book Our Kind of People a few years back. And, you know, there's an image of Black America as being somehow impoverished, undereducated, and not achieving. And Dinus, there has been a Black elite since before the Civil War in this country. Now think about this, Dinus. These African Americans, or they were known as free people of color in the 1800s, have maintained this wealth for almost 200 years.
Right.
Now, you know, and sometimes I think because there's a lack of interaction between the Black elite and, if you will, middle class. So
why is that? If you could answer that after you.
Well, okay. I'm going to answer the question in this, you know, in this way. But in every society, and even in white America or they're Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, in all groups, you have an elite. And African Americans are no different. And oftentimes I think that the elite Blacks, and I want to say this to you too, man, these folks do a whole lot for Black America. It's not publicly known, but they do. I mean, just the tens of millions of dollars that they've donated to HBCUs and to so many causes behind the scene.
You know what my argument was when you told me about the donations to the HBCUs. I was on Morehouse in Clark, Atlanta, and Spelman's campus, you know, not too long ago, and I don't know where that money's going, but I mean,
well, and I think that's a separate issue, perhaps, because you can donate the money, but if the leadership of the institution is mismanaging the funds, and I'm not saying that they are, that's just a completely separate issue. But the point that I want to make, man, is that this segment of the African American population is highly engaged in at least providing funding for less fortunate Blacks. And I think, how do I say this, man? I think that because the image sometimes of African Americans is so negative, and these folks, man, basically, oh my God, they're just they blow up that image because again, imagine this, man. Your family has had money since the 1800s. Think about that. You're living in Maryland or somewhere in New York, not too far, or in Massachusetts, not too far from Martha's Vineyards, what have you, and you can afford a yacht or a trip to Paris or what have you every year. It's just not the norm for the average Black person. And sometimes, man, human nature being what it is, the folks who don't have these resources sometimes can be jealous.
Right. Okay.
You know, because that's just human nature. And no one wants to be marginalized or to looked upon as being problematic. And so sometimes the folks who don't have that capital, man, they think in their minds that that this elite group of African Americans are better, and that's just not necessarily the case. I mean, I admire the fact that they've been able to hold on to this wealth for some 200 years. I admire the fact, man, that the vast majority of the black elite, guess what? They marry other blacks, and they're happy to be African American.
Mhm.
And guess what? Most of them come from two-parent household. You know what, Dinus? Here's the beautiful part of it. They're more stable in terms of how our family used to be 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. I mean, it's just that they have money,
Mhm.
a lot of money, but they do give. They
Okay, so
definitely do give.
someone in the chat room, not to cut you off,
Sure, sure.
they want you to name specifics that the African American elites fund. They want to know specifics. Somebody else is bringing up the term black boule. Can you? Somebody else
Sure.
said there's no black American elite class. Can you address that?
Someone said what?
There's no black American elite
Oh, that's not true. That is absolutely not true, man. And honestly, I would ask just as a small reference, and I won't be argumentative at all,
That's
but I
fine.
would definitely say tell this gentleman to to look at the works of Otis Graham, who writes Our Kind of People. He's written some 12 books, and he, in some ways, serves as somewhat of a spokesperson, basically giving people an idea of what the black elite is all about. And honestly, I'm going to say this, man. Sometimes people will be argumentative, and and what I find problematic is I don't know why people feel the need to kind of, how do I say this? Sometimes they feel the need to put people in their place because they're different. Because this is not the typical perception, if you will, of black folks. Again, people are used to a lot of drama and foolishness and so on and so forth. A lot of these people are not into that stuff. They are highly accomplished African Americans. Yes, some are snotty, but that's fine. But a lot of them, man, they give. I'm actually proud of them. I am actually proud of the fact that they've been able to kind of hold on to their wealth, man, for a long time,
Mhm.
and they give. Like what the Africa America Institute, man, is a direct result of what they've been able to do in Africa. They've been able to do that, and this institution has been around for 65 years, and and it's changing the lives of many, 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 many Africans. But let me just say this to you too. One of the reasons, again, why people need to know this information again is, again, a lot of African Americans, for what because of the mass media, Fox, CNN, and all this stuff, have this negative self-image, about who and what we are. All that I'm saying to you tonight, man, that there are many, many African American communities. There are blacks, as I said, who've had money for a long time. Then there are middle class African Americans, and then there are poor people who are poor and working class. This is all a part of the 50 plus million blacks in this country. We are a complex population.
Hmm. Now, can you name any or specifics in regards to what organizations or what do they donate to that we can actually measure or see
Well,
act?
and again, and again,
Let me ask you this: what are they doing actively right now to
sure, sure,
impact the
sure,
Black
sure.
collective?
You know what? Two things here. And I'm going to give you a number of examples and I mentioned already, and you and I, and I've sent you links in terms of what's going on with with the Africa American Institute. And like I say, that organization is across Africa.
Mhm.
And Melvin Foote, who is the founder of the Constituency for Africa, that's another institution. You are familiar with YALI, right? Which is the Young African Leadership Initiatives. That
I'm,
particular organ,
but
well,
that
that particular
that's something Obama started, correct?
right, that was started by Melvin Foote under the Obama administration, where Obama wanted to kind of set something in place that would, that would provide leadership that would help develop the African continent. This is another example of an African American led organization, man, that that is actually helping to advance the cause of Africa. A third one be, of course, Africare, which was again an institution established by former African American Peace Corps officers who were working across the continent who felt the need. But in terms of what what the boule, if you will, or the Black elites are doing, I would strongly recommend that your listening audience or that your viewing audience critically look at some of the works by Otis Graham, because he's written 12, 13 books, and he talks specifically about what these Black organizations are doing. Now, here's what I think, man. Here's what I think. The critics will say it's not enough, and I would make this argument, man. I would love for your critics to show me what they have been doing. I would love for the critics to show me what millions of dollars that they've actually given.
I'm about to ask one right now. Cool C, what are you doing right now? Please type that in the comment section, please. What are you doing? So, okay, all right, go ahead.
And again, man, let me ask you this question. And I know that you're not being interviewed tonight, but from your perspective, man, when you saw that link on the African American Institute, what were your first thoughts? I mean, I want to know what you thought about that.
I had no clue, because I mean, they propagate and exaggerate this African versus African American beef. They exaggerate how a lot of Black Americans, which is somewhat true, are completely not a lot, how Black America is disconnected from Africa. What I saw in that video was like, damn, like there are Black Americans who are really doing the work in Africa and really making a huge impact.
Thank you.
Huge impact. In fact, I need to post that link in the chat room.
Shoot, and Dynas, and guess what? Those are the boule. I'm sorry. I mean, these are the people who have old money, who were the African Americans who got their freedom, some as early as the late 1700s, right? And who were able to acquire wealth, man, and they still have this wealth. I'm serious, they do. But you know what? There are going to be some people, because they're wealthy Blacks,
right?
That they're not doing enough, and and a lot of it is jealousy. I mean, it's awful to say, and honestly speaking, and I'm not being emotional when I say this, but if I was one of the extreme elite Blacks like this too, I would actually keep my distance too, because you're, as the old saying goes, damn if you do and damn if you don't. Because you have, here's the catch-22 situation that you're in. You're not white, and you clearly know you're Black, but you're not poor. so you have to face discrimination from the white majority, and then at the same token, you're going to face discrimination from middle class and sometimes poor class Blacks because of jealousy, because they think that you're a bougie, or because they think that you're something else, and at the same token, you're giving untold millions of dollars to help people. It's just one of those situations, and it's complicated.
So someone in the chat room made the comment: those elite, Black elite, are European standards and guard dogs of the white elite as impersonators, and they probably don't relate to Africa. What would be your response or rebuttal?
Well, and again, one of the things that I shared with you when we've been speaking here a few weeks now, and I saw your videos online, and I thought maybe not you are aware of what the African American Institute is doing. So I said, well, let me connect with this gentleman and send him this video, and about a 5 or 6 minute video, and honestly, man, the proof is in the pudding.
Right.
The proof is in the pudding in terms of what they're doing.
Right.
And also, I think if I have not, but I can share with you where, by country by country, where these Africans have been assisted. And like I said, man, the current president. I'm sorry? I
said, go ahead. You have the floor. Go ahead.
No, and what I was going to say, man, that the current president of the Ivory Coast is a graduate. I mean, and so many others have benefited from this institution, this renowned institution, which was established by the Black elite, that's assisting Africa. in a real and genuine way. You can measure what they're doing. This is measurable, man. I mean, I'm serious. Um, Dangote, who is the richest person in Africa, in Nigeria, right?
The richest black
He,
person, the richest black
right,
person on the planet.
right. He actually received an award from the African American Institute. I believe it was in 2017, and so I think he is also a part of giving to this institution
Hmm.
because he knows the value of what they're doing to rebuild the African continent. Now, here's the complexity of it, man.
Go ahead.
And oftentimes people are very critical of African Americans. You know, I always ask the questions. Okay, what other diasporic population on the planet is engaging Africa in this way? I can't think of anyone else. I don't know of any nation in any let's just say the largest black population outside of Africa is Brazil.
Right.
I don't know if Afro Brazilians have an institution that is engaging Africa in that way. Clearly, probably the blacks in the Caribbean don't have the capital, and so it's not happening there. And so the only place that I see, the only place on the planet that I see that's engaging Africa in a meaningful way is these organizations that were established by Black Americans that are engaging Africa.
So let me ask you this. Why aren't, I guess, these African leaders who have been impacted by Black Americans, why aren't they vocal about the role we played in, I guess, helping them out?
That is an absolutely excellent question, man. And I think that and this may sound somewhat elitist, but I think that if you're in the right academic circles, then you'll probably hear it from African leaders. And I know that sounds really kind of class oriented, but that's just the reality of it. And that's I think that's the main reason that they don't. Now, and some of them just don't know unless you're part again. I think some of them just don't know, and also too possibly there could be some degree of, I'm just going to say this.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I mean, they may be a bit embarrassed somehow. You know, now I take into consideration, man, that most of those African nations have only had their independence since the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and with Namibia, 90s. And so I understand that that these are new, if you will, democracies or new countries, and they're still finding their place along the way. And so perhaps they have not had time, man, to develop their own separate institutions, perhaps that would engage blacks or the broader diaspora. That's what I'm thinking. Maybe they're still dealing with their own internal issues, and their own internal issues are quite massive.
Mm. Someone in the chat room asked, "What have Africans done for Black Americans?" What?
Oh my God! Now, oh my God, man, that's you know what? And honestly, now the Dinas, I have to my God,
No, but brother, go ahead. I mean,
unfortunately, wow. I'll put it to you this way: they have not engaged. They have not engaged us like we've engaged them, and
why?
that's just the reality of it.
Why? What do you think?
Well, here's the situation, man. Pan-Africanism, the concept of a collective African identity,
Right.
does not emerge in Africa at all. It doesn't. Pan-Africanism emerges in the United States. It emerges in the West Indies, of course. And Africans, unfortunately, are just coming into the realization that they are Africans. You take a country like Nigeria. Well, you're Yoruba, Hausa, Igbo, Afex, Edo, Ibibio. You identify with all these tribes sometimes before you identify with being an African. And so, unfortunately, Africans still don't have are still just beginning to come to a place where they see themselves collectively. Also, too, uh, The educational system in Africa is awful. They don't really teach history. When I was in Ghana back in 2012, I was surprised to find out that there and in other parts of Africa, they don't teach about the legacy of enslavement, which is shocking to me.
They don't even teach about colonialism, from my understanding.
And exactly, and so I was shocked by it, and so I don't think that they really see the Black diaspora as necessarily uh, an extension. If well, okay, the African Union has something called the Sixth Region. The Sixth Region is the Black diaspora, but there is somewhat of a disconnect. And and honestly, I think that because Black Americans are in the West or in the developed world, the so-called developed world, we have more access, and so and resources, and so and and African Americans had time to develop. My God, man! According to John Henry Clark, Black Americans have actually created more independent Black institutions than any other diasporic population on the planet. And so we're using these institutions to engage. And so I'm going to say this, and you may agree or disagree. I,
Right.
I I think if any type of real engagement is going to happen between Blacks
It's
in the
gonna be
diaspora,
Black Americans pretty much kicking it
it's
off. Right.
going to be the Black diaspora or Black Americans taking the lead without question. Absolutely. Because all of these institutions that I'm sharing with you, the Africa America Institute, the Constituency for Africa, Africare, all of these organizations, which are renowned, by the way, were all formed by Black Americans. And they're doing fantastic work across the African continent. And unfortunately, until Africa gets on its feet, the efforts are not going to be reciprocated.
Hmm. Let's see what else we got in the chat room. Yeah, somebody just said in the chat room that Ethiopian Airlines was trying to buy Black American. Yeah, we discussed that. But see, it's surprising that you would never know. I flew in Ethiopian Airlines
Well,
maybe
you,
8,
you
10
know,
times.
that's
You would never know.
well,
Like,
now I will say this: if you go to Addis Ababa, there is a statue of Colonel John Charles Robinson, and that acknowledging that he is the founder. But again, a lot of it has to do with the fact that education is not necessarily a priority for the United States. I think that our first priority is that we are an international businessman, the country. I mean, money is probably the most important factor in the United States. And let me just come home for just a second, and
go ahead.
I do want to mention these folks that I think I talked to you about, and even like we talked about Washington State, and the impact of George Washington Bush, who was an African American born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the late 1790s. He migrates from Philadelphia to Clay County, Missouri, becomes a successful farmer, but because of discrimination, man, he decides to leave Missouri and migrate to Oregon Territory, and this was in 1844. And so he leaves with a number of other families, but unfortunately, before he gets to Oregon, the American law, a provisional law, arrives before he gets there. And once he does get to Oregon, basically he finds out that Oregon does not want any Black folks in their territory at all. So George Washington Bush, the African American George Washington Bush, leaves Oregon, crosses the Columbia River, and the Columbia River is the dividing line between Oregon and Washington Territory. And this particular territory was disputed between the British and the Americans. So he gets to Washington Territory, sets up camp, and establishes Bush Prairie. And he's there for about 6 years. The U.S. and Britain comes back to the negotiating table. Because George Washington Bush has a settlement there, the British give way to the Americans. In essence, what I'm saying to you, Washington State comes becomes a part of the United States as a result of George Washington, the African American George Washington Bush.
Mm.
He is the reason why Washington State becomes a state. And and not only does he does that, George Washington Bush has 6 sons. His oldest son, Williams Owens Bush, becomes the first elected official first elected African American official in Washington State, and he introduces the legislation for the creation of Washington State University. So here it is, you having an African American being responsible for Washington State, and the African American son being responsible for Washington State University.
Wow. I was going to say, tell us a story about, I guess, Nova Scotia or Canada.
Sure. What's most important is, when the new Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture opened September 24th of 2016, the government of Canada sent down a contingency of Black Canadians to celebrate with us. And one of the reasons that they did that, Dinus, is because African Americans have a shared history with Black Canadians. As a matter of fact, man, up until 1965, almost all Blacks in Canada came from the United States. One of the most famous Nova Scotians is Viola Desmond, and Viola Desmond is known as the Rosa Parks of Canada. She was a successful businesswoman. In 1946, on her way to a business meeting, her car breaks down in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia. So while she's getting her car fixed, she goes to a movie, and she goes up to the ticket counter and says, "Hey, I want a ticket for the downstairs location." And the manager says, "Hey, we don't sell tickets to you people." So she purchased the ticket, goes into the theater, and she's sitting with the whites. And within 30 minutes or so, she's arrested by the police and taken out and put into jail, and so on and so forth. But that was the beginning of the civil rights movement in that part of Canada, in the maritime provinces of Nova Scotia. And so with that, it took her, oh my God, 50, 60, 70 years later before she was pardoned by the government of Canada. Now, in 2018 of this year, Viola Desmond will appear on the $10 bill in Canada. She's going to appear on Canadian currency. But if you look at her background in terms of where she came from, Viola Desmond is a descendant of the Black Loyalists. And the Black Loyalists were African Americans who fought on the side of the British during the 1800s. And once the war was over, they all migrated to Canada. And Viola Desmond is a descendant of those folks.
Okay. Now, I know this is a very controversial subject sometimes. And let me ask this question first. Rated RJ wants to know: do you believe Black Americans could lead their own nation? And then,
absolutely.
And then after you answer that, we're gonna jump into Liberia. But go ahead, answer that. Go ahead.
I'm going to link this between Liberia and absolutely. Now, Liberia. Now, I'm going to just go forward into Liberia.
Go ahead.
And I'm doing it for a reason. Liberia came about as a result of America's inability to deal with its increasingly free Black population in the United States. Whites felt like, wait a minute here, these people are free, but they're not equal to us at all. So we need to get rid of them. Hence the creation of Liberia with the American Colonization Society.
Right.
And so in the early 1820s, well, actually in 1820, the first ship, the Elizabeth, leaves New York Harbor with 86 passengers who actually sailed from New York to Sierra Leone. And, and over the course of 25 years or so, those Blacks will eventually settle along the West Coast and establish an area called Liberia. Before they got there, the area was known as the Grain Coast or the Windward Coast, right? And so basically they get there. There are 16 existing tribes who are already there in Liberia. But here's what's problematic about it. Now, when the African Americans get there, man, they see that all of these African tribes are still engaged in the slave trade, all of them. They're all slave trading. And now imagine you are someone coming from the United States, and and perhaps you may be first or second generation free, or maybe you were manumitted by your master to leave the country and come to Liberia, and so you're still seeing these Africans slave trading. It was problematic for those African Americans, and they felt like, oh my God, we need to kind of cling together until we can figure out what to do. But anyway, eventually over time, man, they were able to actually establish a country, and Joseph Jenkins Roberts, who became the first president in 1847, established the country. Fast forward to the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, man, under President Tubman in Liberia,
Right.
and also President Tolbert. Liberia in the 70s, in 79, I'm sorry, in 71 through 79, had was one of the wealthiest African nations, was one of the wealthiest nations on the African continent, man. Liberia actually had a GDP, or per capita income, that was equal to that of Japan. Now, to answer his question, Black Americans had gone back to Africa and had established one of the most successful nations on the African continent. So what happened? Well, now here's the complexity of it. The Blacks who went to Africa were fundamentally American. They were fundamentally, if you will, Afro-Saxons. I'll put it to you in that way. English-speaking, Christian in their orientation. They found Africans there who were traditional Africans. But the Africans also had a difficult time with the Black Americans too, because the Black Americans ended slavery in that area. And again, all 16 of those African tribes were slave trading, which was problematic. And so it created a tension from the very, very beginning. And in 1980, man, Samuel Canyon Doe had President Tolbert killed.
Okay, why did he have President Tolbert killed? Let's get it.
Well, I actually have some Liberian friends of mine who really are honest with me about the situation.
Mm-hmm.
There was a large degree of envy between what they called the settler class, and the settler class were the returning Black Americans and West Indians who settled Liberia.
Mm-hmm.
That community of Blacks, men, had created really almost a replica of America. I mean, a very, very highly successful society that was functioning. Again, man, Liberia was kind of like the United States in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It was kind of like the land of opportunity. Africans from all over Africa came to Liberia because it was successful. Those African Americans had created a firmly middle-income nation. The Africans who had been there for centuries had never done that. And so when Doe had Tolbert killed, man, and of course Liberia would eventually plunge into a 14-year civil war,
right,
where the country has not recovered as of yet. It just has not recovered. Now, what happened was there was a shift in political power. When Tolbert was in power, most of the elected officials were, if you will, so-called Americo-Liberians, or what they call Congo people.
Okay.
After Samuel Doe comes to power, then all of these so-called indigenous people are elected into power for the most part. And again, those people did not have the skills to really govern the country. And again, Liberia today, man, is one of the poorest nations on the African continent. Like I said before.
Let me interject and ask this question real quick. And somebody else brought it up. Do you believe the Black Americans and mulattoes who, I guess, settled, or whatever you want to call it, Liberia, were they controlled, or were they protecting the white interest in Liberia?
Oh no. Let me share something with you. If you read,
and then my follow-up question, if not, can we speak on, if you know about it? I know about it just a little. The Firestone rubber deal.
Right. Let me just say this, man. If you read the Liberian Constitution, right, and it's interesting right now. Now, the current president of Liberia, his name is George Weah.
Right.
And George Weah is an indigenous Liberian. He's Crew.
Okay.
The current Liberian Constitution does not allow. This is kind of crazy. It does not allow non-black people to own own property in Liberia.
Well, dude, that's but the thing is, that's a lot of there's a lot of places in Africa where foreigners cannot own land. Like in Tanzania, if you're a foreigner, the only land
no. That's not what I'm saying. If you look at the Liberian Constitution, if you're white, you can't own property.
Right.
You can't.
Okay.
And that was written into the Liberian Constitution. George Weah is trying to change that.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, I got you. Okay.
George Weah wants whites to be citizens, and right now whites can't be citizens.
Right.
Because see, what you had, man, is a population coming from the United States that had been enslaved, and they wanted to ensure, man, that this was their new home.
Right.
That white people could not have their way in their new home, and so they were written out of the Constitution.
Okay. Completely understand. Okay, makes sense.
But
again, now, to play devil's advocate, a lot of Liberians are saying, well, they need the development, they need the help.
Okay, here's the devil's advocate, man.
Okay.
If you talk to older Liberians, seriously, and you live in Georgia, I believe.
Correct.
There's a large Liberian population in Atlanta area, man.
There is.
And if you sit down and talk to them, they'll tell you, man, that prior to the war, man, Liberia was a well-run, functioning country. Those Black Americans, man, had created one of the most dynamic Pan-African nations on the planet. Let me share this with you too, man. Did you know that Liberia played a leading role and a founding role in the Organization of African Unity, or the African Union? Liberia laid the cornerstone for that. I'm serious. They laid the cornerstone for the Organization of African Unity.
I didn't know that.
Absolutely. Absolutely, man. I mean, listen, here's something interesting too, man. And we talked about this too, that during the Berlin Conference, right, of the 1880s,
right,
1884, 1885,
correct.
There were only two free countries in Africa during this time.
Ethiopia,
of course, and Liberia. And Liberia, and during this time too, man, that Liberia was able to maintain its sovereignty. Now, I will tell you this: in 1905 through 1912, there was something that was called the Liberian crisis. This is when Germany, France, and the UK came to the United States and says, "Hey, listen, is Liberia your colony?" Because they were trying to absorb Liberia into British, French, or German territory in West Africa. And so the U.S. ambassador to Liberia reached out to Booker T. Washington, who was the most powerful African American man in the United States. And the ambassador name escapes me right now, but it said, "Hey, President Washington," meaning he being the president of Tuskegee University, he said that Liberia is in trouble. So Booker T. Washington called a commission of Liberian politicians to the United States. And over the next 5 to 7 years, Booker T. Washington served as the negotiator between Liberia and the United States in terms of getting funding so Liberia could actually maintain its sovereignty. Now clearly there were some issues that it wasn't the best deal. However, what Washington was able to do was to ensure that Liberia maintained its sovereignty from being absorbed by the British, the French, or the Germans. And so he did that. And so what happened was Liberia was able to get a loan from the U.S. government. Now, keep in mind, man, that Liberia got its independence in 1847. So it was a new country. It was a country just finding its way. But but again, think about this, man. They were able to maintain their sovereignty when the entire African continent, man, had been colonized by Europe. I mean, which is pretty amazing. That's pretty amazing, man. That a country settled by formerly enslaved people in the United States, they were able to kind of diplomatically maneuver, so that the British, the French, and the Germans could not colonize them. Now, I want to share this with you too. One of the founding fathers of Liberia, his name was Elijah Johnson. And Elijah Johnson was on the Elizabeth, and the Elizabeth actually left, as I spoke earlier, New York Harbor in 1820. And Elijah Johnson, of course, African American, was the third colonial agent. He was in Monrovia, in 1822, or what would become Monrovia. And the British, a British ship, was sailing by, and they came aboard. And they reached out to Elijah Johnson, and the British says, "Listen, if you allow us to plant our flag on Liberian soil, it will ensure that you're safe from the natives." And Elijah Johnson said, "Absolutely not. You are not going to place your flag on our soil." He said, "This is my home. We've actually come from the United States. We're building a brand new home. It's going to take me more if we allow you to place your flag here. It's going to cost us more for us to replace it or to move it." And so the British says, "Okay," and they left. That was the first African American who had saved Liberia. But also, another person that I want to discuss, man, and I know that I'm kind of all over the place.
No, please.
That we had talked about earlier before. We had talked about the African American Mifflin Gibbs, another Philadelphian. He was from Pennsylvania. He was on the speaking circuit with Frederick Douglass, in the 1830s and 40s, and so Gibbs was not happy with the amount of money that he was making, and so he decided to go west. He ended up out in San Francisco, became an extremely successful business person out there in the 1840s and 50s. However, he was being marginalized by white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, all the blacks were, and so Gibbs was thinking to himself, there must be a place where African Americans can go to find some relief. So he ends up traveling to Panama as a possible new home for African Americans. So got there, found that Panama was not the best place for African Americans. So he comes back and shares with African Americans. It's just not a good choice. However, there was a gentleman in Canada, in Victoria Island, by the name of James Douglas. And James Douglas was a mulatto. He had a Scottish father and a Guyanese mother. Mm-hmm. But James Douglas was the premier of Vancouver Island, or Victoria Island. And he reached out to Mifflin Gibbs, who was, as I said earlier, was a successful, important business person now in California. He says, "Hey, we need some non-Americans." And keep in mind, this was during the Dred Scott decision, so African Americans were not considered as being citizens of the United States, even though they were born here.
Not even human.
Right. And so anyway, James Douglas reached out to Gibbs, and he says, "Listen, we need some non-Americans in Canada to come up." And so Gibbs goes to meet with Douglas in Victoria, Canada, and decides, hey, this is a good deal. And so he comes back, and some 800 African Americans move en masse from California to Victoria Island. Now, Mifflin Gibbs is an exceptional person. He becomes the first elected city council of Victoria. Mm-hmm. He later on serves as the acting mayor of Victoria. Now, here's what's interesting. He's also a part of the Yale Committee, or the Yale Convention, which is the folks who works out the terms and agreement for bringing British Columbia into the Canadian Confederation. So here it is, this African-American, Mifflin Gibbs, is helping British Columbia to become a part of Canada. And this happens in 1871. But a little bit earlier, in 1869, Gibbs migrates back to the United States. He is appointed the first judge in the United States. Later on, he's also appointed as the ambassador to Madagascar. Once he gets back to Madagascar, he actually opens a bank in Arkansas in 1902. And finally, in 1950, he writes his memoirs, which they're forwarded by Booker T. Washington, and he passes away in 1915. But he is an amazing person. Okay. And so this is all a part of the African American narrative. And let me just share a couple of other things with you too.
Please, go ahead. We're enjoying this. Please go ahead.
Sure. Like in the Bahamas, most.
Real quick, and Sultan, after I ask this, you better super chat. Sultan wants to know, can you provide any sources in regards to the information you're giving? And
My
Sultan, hit
book.
that super chat button.
My
Sultan, hit
book.
that super chat button.
Right.
But
And
go ahead.
so in my book. But anyway, like the Bahamas, I'm sure you've been to the Bahamas, right?
I have not been to Bahamas.
Well, most people don't realize that 80% of the Bahamian population uh, are are direct descendants of African Americans. Now, how could that be? Right?
How can that be?
Right. Well,
Well,
during the American Revolution.
I'll cut you off real quick now. It might be the same situation in Jamaica, because Jamaica, the black people in Jamaica were like the rebellious slaves from America. Is that correct?
No, absolutely not.
That's
No,
what people said. That's not
absolutely
true.
not.
That's not true.
No, sir, they were not. Absolutely not.
Okay, well, go ahead. Go ahead. That's what I heard. So, okay.
Well, okay. Here's what you're talking about. Okay, and let me clarify what you're talking about. All right. Briefly, there were a small percentage of the slaves that were brought to the Caribbean first. They were kind of bred and kind of prepared to come to the United States, right? So
Right.
roughly 60,000 or so Africans were actually first. They came to the Caribbean, and they basically kind of prepared them for coming to the United States. But the vast majority of African Americans, man, are direct slaves from Africa. Only 450,000 Africans came to the United States, right? Of the
Right.
12 to 15 million Africans who were exported or transported to the New World, only 450,000 came to the U.S. and Canada. Roughly, the bullseye of the transatlantic slave trade was the Caribbean basin. You're talking about 42% of the slaves went to the Caribbean. You're talking about 5.5 million. Brazil received 38% of the slaves, 5 million. 17% went to Spanish America, which are all the areas where the Spaniards went. You talk about 2 to 3 million. I mean, 2.5 to 3 million. And so, but as I stated before, only 5% came to the U.S. and Canada. That's it. Now, I will tell you this: the difference between the African American experience is this: the white Americans brought sexual parity, what I mean, an equal number of men to women, to the United States. And the average slave woman in the United States had 10 children.
Wow.
As opposed to the Caribbean and Latin America, 2/3 of the slaves were men, 1/3 were women. And the average slave woman in Latin America only had 4 children. Also, a cultural difference too, man. People often wonder why blacks in the Caribbean tend to have been able to maintain more of their African roots. And here's the reason why: the vast majority of slaves that were brought to the Caribbean and South America were African born. They were born in Africa, maintaining that cultural continuity. That's why you have so many patois languages. You have Haitian patois, Jamaican patois, and so on and so forth. Now, with African Americans, interesting enough, by 1820, the vast majority of African Americans were already third, fourth, fifth, sixth generation, far removed from African culture. In essence, African Americans were fundamentally Afro-Saxons. So, and
Okay.
that's the difference. We were far removed from African culture. We were fundamentally American. And believe it or not, by 1825, 25 to 30% of all the blacks in the New World were African American because their survival rate was better. Their survival rate was better within the United States. But to get back to the Bahamas, one of the reasons why 80% of the black population in the Bahamas are African Americans is during the American Revolution, the whites and the blacks who were loyalists to the British evacuated and left the American South. And in 1783, the Bahamas only had 4,000 people, 2,000 whites, 2,000 blacks, right?
Right.
But one of the places that the British gave safe harbor to was the Bahamas. So from 1783 to 1785, roughly 8,000 to 9,000 loyalists, black and whites, migrate to the Bahamas. And for the first time in history, the Bahamas becomes a predominantly black nation. Now, I'm sure you've heard of Esther Rose Good Times, right?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, Esther Rose, she's actually Bahamian. She was born in Florida, but she's actually Bahamian. However, her ancestors came from South Carolina and Georgia in the 1700s. Roles were some of the slaves who came from the United States that migrated to the Bahamas. I'm sure you've heard of Al Roker and Roxy Roker.
Well, I know Al Roker's the on the news, correct? The
Yep, his family
yeah,
comes from
Today Show,
Georgia. And
whatever. Yeah.
yep, his family migrated. Well, the Rokers, the white Rokers, actually slave owners, migrates from Georgia and South Carolina to the Bahamas. Lenny Kravitz, I'm sure
Yeah, of course.
singer.
Yeah, he's mixed though.
Well, right, his mother is named Roxy Roker. She's Al Roker's cousin. Well, was Al Roker's cousin. And so, but all of these folks were actually in the United States in the 1780s, 1790s, but they migrate to the Bahamas. And like I say, man, if you trace back the heritage of Bahamians, 80% of the black population have direct African American roots from Georgia, from South Carolina, from Virginia, and from Florida. These people are 200 and some years ago, they were in the United States. Now, and one more thing too, we actually talked about Australia too, and most people don't realize
Oh yeah, I forgot. Yeah,
that
bring up
that
the, go
that
ahead.
that Australia and maybe your viewing audience, your listening audience is unfamiliar with the term bush ranger. And
Does
within Australia,
anybody in the chat room know what a bush ranger is? Press one or go ahead and please in the chat go ahead and list what a bush ranger is. But go ahead, brother Dave.
well, okay, if you remember the movie Crocodile Dundee, that's a perfect example of a bush ranger. And bush rangers are the most iconic figure in Australian culture. They're kind of like on par with our George Washington. Well, interesting enough, man, the very first bush ranger in Australian history was an African American by the name of John Black Caesar. Now, people ask the question, how in the hell did John Black Caesar or a Black American become a bushranger in Australia? Well, again, during the American Revolution, there were tens of thousands of African Americans who fought on the side of the British.
Right.
Now, roughly 4,000 or so went to Nova Scotia. 5,000 blacks ended up in the UK. Unfortunately, what happens is once these blacks get to the UK, the British says, listen, we're not going to pay remittance, we're not going to pay your pensions and all. And so those blacks became among the poor in London. And so many of them became criminals. And once they were sentenced to court, once they went to court, they were sentenced. And many of them were shipped to Australia. And so in 1787, the first 11 ships leave Portsmouth, England, man, en route to Australia. And it takes them 8 months because Australia is roughly 11,000 miles from the UK. And so, but on board the ship, man, are a dozen African Americans. And so when they arrive in Botany Bay, Australia, in 1788, there are a dozen African Americans on board. And believe it or not, man, today in 2018, there are roughly 20 to 30,000 Australians that have African American ancestry.
Right.
And
Wow.
but I can go on and on in terms of how we can see the international impact of blacks across the globe, man. For example, in Bermuda, most of the academic institutions in Bermuda, man, were founded by the AME Church.
Okay.
Now, another example, are you familiar with the term Americans? American is spelled Merkin.
Okay. I'm not.
Well, the Americans are the descendants of African Americans who settled in Trinidad and Tobago, man, during the War of 1812.
Okay.
There were blacks who the 45,000 blacks who came to the British, and they said, "We'll fight for you if you grant us our freedom." And those blacks fought for the British for 2.5 years. As a matter of fact, man, in 1814, the blacks, along with the British, burned down the White House. I've actually been to the White House and I've seen the burn marks. I took a tour of the White House about a couple of years ago, and I see where the White House was actually burned down. And those African Americans that had actually burned down the White House. Anyway, once the war was over, the vast majority of those blacks ended up in Canada. They went to the Maritime provinces, which includes Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. Some of them also settled in the eastern townships of Quebec because that's English speaking. Others went to Bermuda, and there's a significant number of those blacks who settled in Trinidad and Tobago. And so when you go to Trinidad today, there's a distinct population in Trinidad called Americans. As a matter of fact, the former Prime Minister, bless his soul, Patrick Manning, he was the Prime Minister from 2006 to 2010, I believe. He passed away. His wife, Hazel Manning, who was a senator in Trinidad and Tobago, and she also served as the Secretary of Education. She was a descendant of an African American. She is American. And so that's just an example, man, of again of the impact of Black America. I'm going to give you another example, man.
Go ahead.
Are you familiar with George Lyle?
George who?
George Lyle.
I'm not. No, I'm not.
He was an African American born in Burke County, Virginia, in the 1700s, early 1750s. Migrates to Savannah, Georgia, and he establishes the first African Baptist Church. He's a black loyalist, and so again, after the American Revolution, when the British loses the war, he migrates to Jamaica. He establishes two churches in Jamaica. The first one he established is the first African Baptist Church. He also establishes the Ethiopian Baptist Church in Jamaica. Now, what Lyle is doing is laying the groundwork for the emergence of Samuel Sharp and Paul Bogle. And Paul Bogle and Samuel Sharp, man, are Jamaican national heroes. And so what these guys are doing, man, is that they're using the Baptist faith, man, to serve as a liberation point, man, for freeing slaves. So what I'm saying to you is that George Lyle, his foundational work in terms of spreading the Baptist faith throughout Jamaica, man, and again, it later being adopted by Samuel Sharp and Paul Bogle, helps in some way, man, to lead Jamaica to its Emancipation Proclamation. And again, this is an example of the impact, again, of Black America on a global scale. And and all of this stuff is actually in my book. I mean, I just touched the tip.
Okay, what's your book? People were that's what they were asking in the chat. What's your link to your book?
Right. It's going to be online. Here's what I'm going to do here. It right now I'm doing some editing to it, but it will be online within the next few months. And so I'll reach back out to you and I'll share.
You could come on, and when you launch your book, you could come back on and we could definitely discuss it. No problem.
Right. But my point being with this, man, is that again, it's extremely important that again, let me just say that, and let me give you one more example, man.
Go ahead.
Of the impact of the African American narrative, and you and I talked about the African exclusionary measures, right?
Not really, no.
Well, okay. The Panama Canal was complete in 1914, and the primary labor force that was used were West Indian immigrants, Black immigrants from Central South America, so on and so forth. So once the canal was complete, man, there were some in the U.S. government who were fearful that these Black immigrants would try to immigrate to the United States. So there were some amendments made to our immigration policy in 1914, which basically denied or excluded Blacks from the West Indies, Blacks from Latin America, Blacks from Africa from coming to the United States. So Booker T. Washington, who at this time was the most successful, most powerful Black man in the United States, heard about this, and he quickly reached out to his Tuskegee machine, which were his power brokers behind the scene, man. And within 1 week, Booker T. Washington was able to have that legislation killed in Congress. In essence, what I'm saying to you, Dinez, if that legislation would have passed, blacks after 1915 could not immigrate to the United States. So what that means is this: Marcus Garvey, who came
Right.
to the United States in March of
And
1916,
let me stop you real quick. Somebody, okay, you brought up Marcus Garvey. Somebody said that George Weahs, the president of Liberia, is his brother like the president of the UNIA, I think it's called, or Marcus Garvey's organization. Let me try to find it in here. Are you familiar with what I'm referring to?
Well, right. The UNIA is, of course, Marcus Garvey's organization. And let me just share this with you too, man.
But they're saying that George Weah is his brother is the president of it or affiliated with it somehow.
You know what? Now, as you well know, man, that the UNIA is after Garvey was expelled from the United States, it kind of collapsed, if you will. He could never really revive what it was. And I'm not familiar with if George Weah's brother is a part of the organization. I don't know.
Okay.
But I will say this, man. Again, Booker T. Washington made it possible for Black immigrants to come to the United States.
Okay.
That's a fact. And interesting enough, too, man. Most people think that the UNIA was an anomaly, and it was not at all. If you have a chance, man, to read the Booker T. Washington papers, and the Booker T. Washington papers are 15 volumes, and and each volume is roughly 300 to 500 pages, but all primary sources. And Garvey basically, when he decided to establish the UNIA, man, he critically looked at he closely looked at what Booker T. Washington was doing at Tuskegee. And honestly, man, I'll tell you this.
Go ahead.
That the UNIA is a replica in many respects, man, of the Booker T. Washington Tuskegee model. It's a replica. Mm-hmm. It's not something that's original at all. Look, Garvey basically he lived in Europe for a while. He traveled extensively throughout the Caribbean and in South America. Finally, when he got to the United States in March of 1916, this is what he had to say about the Black population in the United States. He says, "I found the most advanced Black population on the planet," and this is why, man, that the UNIA was headquartered in New York. It would have never worked in Jamaica. And even when he was expelled from the United States, Garvey was unable to revive it. Unfortunately, it could only really work in the United States. It would have never worked in Africa. Mm-hmm. Never. And and Garvey understood that. Mm. And there's a stereotype, man, that which is really false. Something to the effect that they said that Garvey found the people with a wishbone and gave them a backbone. They're talking about Black Americans. Look, John Henry Clark said this, that African Americans have created more independent Black institutions than any other diasporic Black population. Not because we were smarter, or not because we had more money, it's because we had to. We were under the type of white supremacy that if you didn't establish for yourself, it wouldn't happen. And and we were a people, man, under oppression. If you were in the Caribbean, you were a Black person in the majority. There was no need for, if you will, an African Methodist Episcopal Church. There was no need for, let's just say, gospel music, or jazz or blues or all these different types of stuff. We had to kind of create this because we were a nation within a nation being oppressed by a white majority. So, because as I stated earlier, man, African Americans have a special type of persecution, and out of that persecution has been the most creative. One of the most creative populations on the planet. I mean, that's just, and that just can't be debated. And I tell people this too, man. one cannot extract America from the Black population. Black Americans are anchored in every aspect of U.S. history. Without the African American narrative, there is no United States of America. It doesn't exist. Without the African American narrative, there is no Canadian narrative. It doesn't exist. You can't extract it. Impossible. Absolutely impossible.
Mm.
And for better or worse, man, we are Americans. Whether whites or anyone else want to accept it or not. I mean, it's just the truth. And I didn't at all touch upon the inventions and these other types of things, which are more commonly known. But I really wanted to look at some other things, man, that that we've done, because I'm almost certain that probably a good majority of your listening audience was not aware of of the impact that George Washington Bush had on Washington State, or Mifflin Gibbs had on the establishment of.
Real quick, Professor. Suede Capone said that by far you're the best guest that I've had on. And I've had some dynamic people on here. That's why I was pulling your arm for you to come on the platform, and twisting your arm for you to come on the platform. Because I mean, the information you were giving me impacted me so much. I'm like, people have to hear this. This has to be this. We have to share this information. This can't just be this conversation. This information cannot be limited to just a phone conversation. Like, you got to come on.
Right.
Go ahead.
Right. And listen, you are. I'm going to give you a couple of more things here. Are you familiar with Nnamdi Azikiwe?
Go ahead.
Nnamdi Azikiwe was the first president of Nigeria, right? And,
okay.
He graduated from Lincoln University in 1930. And again, he was mentored by Ralph Bunche. And just a little bit later, Kwame Nkrumah, again, mentored, graduate from an HBCU, Lincoln, and many of the early African leaders, man, went to our schools. And let me just say this: you've heard of the Dalit population, right? In India?
Who? Say that one more time.
The Dalits, the untouchables of India.
Yeah, of course.
Sure you've heard of them, right?
Yeah.
Well,
right.
the contemporary name, and I'll spell it. Dalits is spelled D-A-L-I-T-S. Dalits. Mm-hmm. And of course, they're generally Southern Indian or the darker ones. And most people don't realize that, as I stated to you earlier, the African Methodist Episcopal Church has had a footprint on the ground in India, man, for quite some time. And the AMEs have been working directly with the Dalits of India. I'm going to say this to you too, man. The AME Church in some ways is like the Black Vatican.
Okay.
And what I mean by that, man, the AME Church is the oldest and largest.
Didn't what's his name? Where the white supremacist racist Dylan Roof. The name of that church, is it what did that guy start the AME Church, or did he just organize a slave rebellion? Vesmar did what's his name? Help me out.
Denmark Vesey.
Denmark Vesey. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, he was definitely a member of the AME Church down in that part of South Carolina. I believe it was South Carolina. It is
South Carolina.
And right. And again, as I stated earlier, the origin of the AME Church, man, is in Philadelphia with Richard Allen, of course.
Right.
And but as an institution, man, let me just say this to you, and I don't want to dismiss what you're saying.
Go ahead.
It's interesting with this particular institution that wherever you go around the country, man, this is the legacy of our experience again. If you go to have you been to the Pacific Northwest?
I mean, I've been to Seattle. I've been to Washington, Oregon. I'm from Sacramento originally, so I've been to Washington.
Okay. One of the things when blacks begin to migrate from the South and scatter all over the country, one of the first things they do, man, African Americans, is establish a church. So in Seattle, you have an AME church that's been there since the 1880s, 1870s, 1860s. You have the AME Church in Oregon. They're being there since the 1880s, 1890s. They're all over the country.
Right.
The African Methodist Episcopal Church, man, it is a global institution, and you find them in every state in the United States. There are actually 20 Episcopal districts, man, around the globe. And as I was stating to you before, man, it's kind of like the Black Vatican. It is, because it's the oldest independently owned Black Protestant organization in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And they're all over the place. As a matter of fact, man, there are a lot of Afro-Brazilians have actually come up under the umbrella of the AME Church, because what happens is, once they become a part of, once their institutions become a part of the AMEs, they can actually attend university within the United States.
Wow.
Because they're AME universities all over the country. And again, man, I think sometimes African Americans tend to kind of minimize their own contribution.
Because you got to understand, we're not taught it. That's why no one like what you're doing. This is probably the most information that anyone on this chat, including myself, has ever gotten in regards to the contribution of African Americans to this
right.
on this planet. Outside of when I go to Africa or when I go to Europe, they love rap music and hip hop. Outside of
well, you remember, right, and honestly, that's Tallahassee Coates. You've heard of him, right?
Who?
His name is Tallahassee Coates. He's a young African American kind of scholar. He wrote. I
know you're talking about. He wrote. He was doing some stuff with Black Panther. I know exactly what you're talking about. Cornel West is beefing with him right now, correct?
Right. He wrote the book River 8.
Okay, yeah, I know you're talking about.
He wrote the book River 8 Years in Power, and I saw him on the Culture Nandi show, which is a local show in the Washington D.C. area a few weeks back, and he said that he had gone to France for a year or two to improve his French.
Uh-huh.
And when he was there, man, he was, he had learned to be less critical of African Americans, because the blacks in France were like, they actually looked up to Black Americans. Because the French black, he was saying, my God, you African Americans, you have all these institutions. You have the NAACP, you have the Urban League, you have all these churches, and you have the HBCUs, and you have the banks. He said, we have nothing in France. And he met this French black guy who was trying to create something that was, I guess, an equivalent to the NAACP, if you will. And this was in 2008, 2009. In essence, they have no institutions at all, man. If the blacks in Europe really have no, look, there are no HBCUs, okay?
Right.
There are no AME churches. There are no black banks. And so they don't have any of this stuff. And so they look to us as being like, wow, and so Coates was saying, my God, you know what, now that I'm outside of America, I have a better appreciation for what we African Americans have actually kind of achieved.
But I have to play devil's advocate. Like, just
sure.
Now, here we go. This will be my argument. It's great that we have all these institutions, but what are they actually doing? How are Black people right now benefiting from these institutions? Let me give an example.
Well,
let me give you an example real quick, and you can answer it. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. I live in an area called the West End. You have Clark Atlanta, Morehouse, Spelman, Morris Brown, of course, is, I guess, pretty much defunct. You have churches everywhere, but the amount of poverty in this area until white gentrification money came over here, I mean, this area was rough. And again, you have the four major HBCUs. You have Black churches everywhere, institutions everywhere, but it's just the condition of our people was bleak. It still is bleak. And when you come over here, you see development, but again, that's white gentrification money. And that's pretty much the narrative across America. So even though we have Black banks and all these institutions, how are Black people present day benefiting from these institutions?
Excellent question, man. You know what we in the 1960s went from we to me. And here's the issue, man, with this. African Americans or Americans, period, are ruggedly individualistic, without question.
Okay, you are.
And
So you answered it, and you're right. Okay, there you go. But go ahead and continue.
sure, sure. And oftentimes, man, we want to do it ourselves. You follow what I'm saying? And sometimes that's kind of problematic, man. Instead of working together as a unit, we don't believe in that, man, in terms of that type of unity that we used to have. It's gone. Look,
Mhm.
man, look, African Americans have enough to my God, man, we collectively are $2 trillion. Please, man, we would be what, close to either the 10th or the 14th largest economy in the world. I mean, if the the capital was there, man, but again, people prefer individual freedom, man, in terms of working as a collective. And I just think that's where we are. Now, I will say this, going back to the black elite, they understand collective economics.
Right.
That's why they've been able to kind of hold on to their money for 200 years.
Mm.
And guess what? I don't blame them. I just don't. And guess what? I'm not upset with them at all. And and because they tend to be exclusive, I don't blame them. But they still give because again, you're in a society, man, where individual freedom reigns supreme, and that's where we are. And unfortunately, that's just not going to change, man. Along with all the other illness that blacks have had, being the population that went through centuries of terror, centuries of slavery, 100 years of Jim Crow, then decades of bad public policy decisions, which were disrupted to healthy black family development, and now the new Jim Crow, which is mass incarceration. Our particular historical narrative, man, is it's impossible to compare us to anybody. It's just too different.
Right.
It's just way too different, man. I hear people all the time that try to compare us to Hispanics and African immigrants who are coming here and whatever else they can. Who again? Who do you compare? My question to you, Dinus,
Go ahead.
what are the group in this country, as I said earlier, and I just repeated this, and I'm going to just say it again.
Go ahead.
What other group in this country has had to endure 450 years of
No
terror,
one. No one.
two,
No one.
200, 250 years of slavery,
Mhm.
100 years of Jim Crow, again, decades of bad public policy decisions which were disrupted to healthy black family development, and now the new Jim Crow, which is mass incarceration. I mean, we've just been bombarded with a lot of craziness. And again, to go back to what I said with the black elite, those people have been able to achieve in spite of that insanity,
Mhm.
which is really isn't a miracle. It is a miracle. And with Africa, man, I think that I mean, I think it's an issue if the Africans are just being kind of critical because again, I look at the African continent, man, and tribalism and mismanagement and all these types of things, man, are also a serious problem there. And oftentimes these Africans really aren't successful until they come to the United States. And again, they're here because of us. No African American narrative, no United States of America.
Mm. Let's see if we have any more questions in the chat room. Kintunde Bowden, thank you so much for the super chat. Let me scroll up real quick. Sultan, thank you for the super chat. We have some more people. I'll just pass them up. Desmond Johnson, thank you so much for the super chat. Yami, 2012, thank you so much for the super chat. Brother, we've been on 2 hours, and thank you so much for giving us this much needed information. I know you're a busy guy. The floor is yours, you could go ahead and close out. But if you want to continue, by all means, go ahead.
No, listen. I know that I'm gonna have to kind of hop into bed here, but no, I truly enjoy sharing this information as an academic. Uh, Again, it's extremely important, man, that that we Black Americans, man, we should be proud of our contributions. I tell people all the time, I am thrilled to death for being an African American. I am so proud of us. I mean, really, we are. I mean, we are an exceptional people. I mean, there is nobody like us. I'm serious. I know that may sound a bit crazy. There is nobody like the African American. I'm serious. We are a unique breed, and I think that we should not take a back seat to anybody because again, everyone has benefited from our legacy. They're benefiting from our legacy, man. And that's just the reality of it, man. And so no one should ever be ashamed of our past as being enslaved and these types of things. I mean, that's just history. We actually still made it. I mean, there's the old gospel song that's called "How I Got Over." My soul looks back and wonder how I got over, and that's true. And that's a powerful testimony to the determination of a group of people to just continue to move forward. I'm just hoping that in the future that we learn to respect one another, understand that there is diversity within the Black community, that there is a Black elite, and that those people are engaged, and that we shouldn't run them away because they have something to share with us, man. They help change the negative stereotype of us being underachievers because these people are superachievers. And they've been that way for a long time. That's pretty much. But I'm glad that your audience enjoyed the information.
They loved it. They absolutely loved it.
Okay, well, that's great, man. And again, I'm glad that I can share. You know what, I was thinking to myself, well, should I do this? And I thought to myself, you know what?
Yeah, I'm glad you did it. I'm glad I twisted your arm and got you on here because people needed to hear this. They absolutely loved it.
Okay. Well, listen, I'm gonna. If that's it, Dinus, I'm gonna run here, man.
Well, Professor Davis, if you want to, it's up to you. If you want to give your contact information, people are asking, how can I reach this brother? If you want to give that out, that's completely up to you.
Yeah, they can reach me via email, and see, I think I text. Here we are. If the folks are interested, let me just say they can send me an email, and they can reach me at Davis, Davis, L as in Lawrence, N as in Nathaniel, 20750 at yahoo.com. And and I'll definitely respond to them, man. And again, and I'll repeat it again just in case. That's going to be Davis, LN 20750 at yahoo.com. And again, man, I've just scratched it. I've honestly scratched the surface in terms of who we are. It's just the tip of the iceberg, really.
Wow, man. Again, thank you so much for coming on. Everybody who super chatted, thank you so much for super chatting. If you're new to the stream, please like. If you're new to the page, please subscribe. Make sure you guys go to Search for Uhuru on Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, and Facebook. Also go to searchforuhuru.com. Go to Amazon.com, search your name, Dinus Amir. Please buy a book, and also go to dinusamir.com. Everybody, thank you so much. Last question. Sultan wants to know, are you open to debating? How do you feel about what's your thoughts on that? Sultan wants to debate you so bad. Like he wants to challenge you so bad.
Well, listen, I'm an academic, and I just have no interest in terms of look. I'm all about providing, I think, positive information for people who may not know these facts. And I honestly don't see how a debate is going to be beneficial to me in this regard. I'm honestly not interested. I'm more along the lines of more mainstream academics who's presenting facts, presenting information. I'm not interested in terms of the Tariq nasheed and this stuff like this, to me, it's not fruitful at all. Now, this may sound like the this actually may sound like I've been around the boulets too long, what have you. But no, but I mean, here it is. Honestly, here's the information. Do with it what you like. What I would say to that gentleman, listen, just take it and research it for yourself, and go for there. But honestly, I don't want to be in a situation where I'm not being fruitful at all. But I just want to just provide good information for people. And no controversial foolishness.
Last question, I promise. This is the last question, and you can hang up. Are you saying that we aren't African, the Africans here in America?
Oh, we're African Americans.
Okay.
We're definitely African Americans. And so, sure. I mean, no question about it. Look, let me just say this to you, man. African Americans, I mean, genetically speaking, we are an amalgam of folks whose ancestors are as far north as what is Mauritania today, through the Senegambia region, Nigeria, Ghana, Cameroon, what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Angola, all the way around to the east coast to Madagascar, and add to that roughly 20 to 30% of our ancestors are also European and or Native American. So in some ways, we are new people. And we've been fundamentally shaped by our experience here in the United States. But no, that's why we call ourselves African Americans. That's why the Canadians call themselves African Canadians. They're not denying the fact that they're not of African ancestry, without question. But now, to be honest with you, I'm probably like most Black Americans. I self-identify as Black. However, I'll be honest with you. My great grandfather is white on my mother's side. My grandmother is half white on my father's side. I have Native American ancestry, and so what I just said to you is not that uncommon. Most of us are the product of the American experience. That's a reality. I mean, it is what it is, but I self-identify as Black. I don't self-identify as mulatto or Native American, although I have white and Native American ancestry. I am an African American.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Again, Professor Davis, thank you so much for having us on, man. We really appreciate it. We have to have you back on whenever you're free again. You have a home here. Again, everybody on the chat, they appreciate the information you gave and the knowledge you gave. Because again, a lot of us, we haven't heard this before. So thank you so much for coming on. Guys, Dynasty Mirror Search for Huru. Till next time. I might come back on later on tonight. I might not. I don't know. But till next time, everybody. Again, thank you. Peace.
Thank you, man.